that we're very pleased to have with us today former Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who was a co-author of the Lower St. Croix Act of 1972 as one of the many acts of kindness that he did for our country in connection with the environment. And of course, being from the St. Croix Valley and from Wisconsin, it was kind of a natural interest of his as well. Senator, what do you feel are the main reasons that the Lower St. Croix was chosen to become a part of the National Wild and Scenic River System?
Well, I know the main reason because I authored the bill. I grew up on that river or nearby, and it was clear to me that this was a magnificent river, and the whole thing ought to be preserved. There is, of course, Northern States Power Company had protected 70 miles from Taylor's St. Croix Falls north. If it hadn't been for their holding and not allowing it to be developed, it would have been plastered all the way for 70 miles because it's so close to the cities. Now, the Lower St. Croix is also a remarkable, remarkably beautiful place, and it's all within a few miles of a huge metropolitan area of a couple of million people with beautiful pure water. If you look at the water from a photograph from above, it's clear and blue. When the St. Croix runs into the Mississippi, it's blue right up till it hits the Mississippi, and then it's muddy brown. So it was clear to me when my staff drafted the legislation that we ought to preserve the Upper St. Croix and the Lower St. Croix, although they're different rivers and they ought to be preserved and protected in a different way. But this is a remarkable piece of beautiful water, the Lower St. Croix. My hope is that we can manage it to protect its uniqueness and its integrity for a long time into the future, or forever into the future.
And then your role in evaluating and designating was as an author of the legislation, is that correct?
Yes, I started when I was governor. I grew up on that river, as I say. 65 years ago, we used to visit friends in St. Croix Falls, and when I was 10 years old, I saw that beautiful river, and I've fished it and canoed it and camped on it over the years. So when I was elected governor, I thought maybe we could lease the river. And I talked to our Department of Natural Resources. I talked to Jack Hoffman of Northern States Power. It wasn't really a very practical idea, leasing it. But anyway, I was trying to design. Well, when I went to Washington as a U.S. Senator, it was clear to me the way to do it was to put it in the Park Service. So we started drafting legislation probably late 1963 when I arrived in Washington. And then the bill was introduced in '65 with Senator Mondale as a co-sponsor on that bill. And indeed, the bill passed the Senate before there was any Wild and Scenic Rivers bill, but it didn't pass the House. Then Senator Mondale and I introduced it again in 1967. And then about that time, along came the National Wild and Scenic Rivers bill, and I was on the committee, and I decided to put that bill in there because I had concluded that bill was going to finally pass both houses.
Were there any prominent public interest issues or controversies that you feel added impetus for the designation or provided resistance to the designation at that time that you can recall?
Any interest groups
or controversies or issues that were raging at that time? I know the power plant issue was preceding that ultimate act, but that had been part of it that I believe you had even had a hearing on yourself at one time.
Yes, I testified against the power plant because I just didn't think it ought to go in at that place, but it did. Well, I wasn't aware of any particular controversy, excepting whenever you decide to bring a piece of property with the complicated private ownership, public ownership into the Park Service. There are going to be all kinds of people involved and not liking what you do or opposing, you know. So it was very complicated. But I didn't give that a lot of thought. It was my view that the whole river ought to be protected. And that's the way I introduced the legislation in 1965, and that's the way it passed in that year later.
So really, you were not necessarily impressed by any threats or perceived threats to the corridor that might have been instrumental at that time. Is that right?
Well, it was clear to anybody who was familiar with the river and its location and that close to a major metropolitan area that was continually growing, that if something wasn't done to protect the integrity of the shoreline of that river and the use of that river, that pretty soon it would be just another polluted downtown city river, like we've got dozens and dozens all over this country. So we were able to save the upper St. Croix, and Northern States Power gave us almost all of that land for the first 70 miles up the river. Down below, we had to work out some other much more complicated things because there were all kinds of individual ownerships involved and municipalities. But it was clear to me that unless we did something, the beauty of the lower St. Croix would be destroyed in a handful of years.
And that would be primarily by overdevelopment and overuse, is
Correct.
that right?
Overdevelopment, overuse, both on the water and on the shoreline.
Why do you feel federal designation was selected over other possible arrangements, such as state or regional or local actions, as the best course for the valley? And do you feel offhand that other options were adequately explored?
I didn't, so far as I was concerned in drafting the legislation, when I got to Washington, I never even gave a second thought to any other options. There weren't any other options that really made sense. When you consider if we were going to buy this land, say from Northern States Power Company, it would cost tens of millions of dollars. Where we were going to get the money? The states wouldn't come up with that money. So there was only really one solution, and the solution was to put it in the National Park Service. I never gave a second thought to any other solution.
And on the lower St. Croix as well, that would be,
Yeah.
even though it was more complicated, the federal solution was still the one that made the most
I didn't
sense.
think there's any other way that you were going to acquire the easements that were needed, and that you were going to have a management plan that could, if really enforced, could protect the lower St. Croix. I don't think there was any alternative. We'd be arguing about that for the next 50 years, and nothing would happen. By the time something happened, it would be too late.
What do you feel were the main obstacles or challenges to designation of the Riverway in the 70s at the federal or state or local level?
Well, actually, things went along very nicely. We had we had lots of support. We had support of the major press, the Minneapolis papers, the Milwaukee, Madison papers. We had support from all kinds of groups. And of course, you had that wonderful group, SOS, Save Our St. Croix. And they were grassroots. So when we had hearing at St. Croix Falls on the lower St. Croix, I was looking recently at a press release. We said several hundred people showed up, but I know it was a huge crowd, and it was very positive support for the concept. There was no organized opposition that I'm aware of. There were individuals or this or that, but nothing organized. Basically, the concept of everybody who knew that lower river knew that unless we did something, it would lose its uniqueness by overpressure in a short time, and everybody wanted to protect it. And actually, I don't recall, there may have been, but I don't recall any major objections.
How well do you feel the founding legislation satisfied the desires and expectations for the use and development of all the people that you say support it. Do you feel that the legislation ended up fully satisfying them, or most of them, or compromised enough to get
Well,
by?
I don't really have any way to judge, number one, what the expectation was. I know the expectation was that they wanted to protect it. My concern about it is that it's being overpressured, and what are we going to do if we allow it to continue? In 1971, both the Park Service and the Minnesota-Wisconsin Boundary Waters organization, already said that on weekends it had reached the saturation point in use in 1971. Park Service says it had reached the optimum by 1971. Now that pressure is doubled or quadrupled. And if it does that a couple more times, we're just going to have a floating Coney Island on the lower St. Croix and destroy its uniqueness. So I hope we'll design some way to hold down the pressure on the lower river.
Can you comment on what you feel the prevailing public desires, expectations, or fears were about the future of the river valley at that time, apart from what you've said about the pressures?
No, nothing other than that there was a great concern about it and a great interest. And once we had put in legislation, that became a rallying point for people all over, not just in the valley. After all, there were people all over Minnesota and Wisconsin, a long way from the valley, who knew the river and knew that it was a magnificent asset and resource that ought to be protected.
You've spoken very strongly about the prevailing public sentiment. Would you say that that sentiment was expressed very strongly and universally, or strongly by a majority of people with a vocal minority, or maybe a vocal minority with a majority of silent objectors? I sense that you're leaning on that.
Basically, from my dealings with it over a number of years, I would say there was a remarkable consensus by a very large majority of people that we ought to be doing something to save it. And I'm not aware of any really organized objections to it.
What do you recall, maybe beyond the hearings that you've mentioned, about the level and value of citizen and local government involvement in any aspects of the legislative process? There was also a Washington hearing, I know, and you must have had contacts from constituents along the way. Was that a high level of involvement in your mind compared to other issues you dealt with?
Well, I guess it depends upon the issue, but actually, as I said a few moments ago, the approval rate was very high to do something about this, protecting this river. And you probably don't very often get that good a consensus on an issue as complicated as that, where so many people, so many private holdings, municipalities, and so forth had an interest in the river, and they didn't join hands to frustrate the objective of doing something to protect the river. I think most of the people who were, the people who were landowners along the river, and the people in the municipalities, and the people in the whole valley, all were agreed we ought to be doing something. They may have differed on specifics here and there, but the people who had a direct interest in terms of owning property there wanted something done to protect it too.
Do you feel the fact that the lower St. Croix corridor was under study for nearly 3 years before the congressional designation, and in the plan formulation for over 3 years after designation, did that have any positive or negative effect on the understanding and acceptance of the riverway, do you think?
Well, I suppose the fact that it was being studied and then recommended for inclusion, obviously we'd have some impact. But as I pointed out, we did pass that in 1965 or 66 with the Lower St. Croix Inn. And I got a feeling that most of the public thought we'll ultimately get the Lower St. Croix. And the reason it didn't get in the first time is that they hadn't finished the studies. And when they started these studies in 1963, I talked to Stuart Udall and others at Interior about be sure to include St. Croix in the study. That's the reason, if they hadn't included it in the study, we wouldn't have been ready to include it in the, as an instant wild and scenic river at the time the bill passed in 1968. It would have been delayed until the study was completed. So we were ready for it. But I think generally speaking, everybody thought that things were rolling positively, and that the fact that there had to be a completed study, I'm not aware of anybody being disturbed. I think everybody assumed we're going to get it.
Pause for a second. I was going to. We're rolling.
I have one more question that relates to the actual designation. If the Lower St. Croix corridor was proposed as an addition to the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System today, do you feel it would be designated? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Well, I don't have any reason to believe that the people who were concerned about preserving the beauty of this stretch of river would have changed their minds. Now, if nothing had been done, of course, there would have been a lot more economic development and building and construction on the river, and maybe by now it would be hardly worthwhile to do. I don't know. We were aiming to preserve the vision or the view from the river, and if everything had gone in that people had wanted to put in, maybe it would have degraded it so far that it wouldn't happen. I don't know that, but I think most people want that river saved, and I don't know what they'd think today, or whether there would be a strong economic interest in some groups in not doing that.
One follow-up question on that point, because there was a follow-up meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1975, which you were part of, along with Senator Mondale and Senator Humphrey and many others, with regard to the level of funding.
Yeah, that was 74, I think.
74, and I think 75,
Yeah,
the
maybe.
amendment was passed, along with other amendments to the generic act. But why there was a concern about the apparent inadequacy of the funding, and why there seemed to be such a strong congressional interest in seeing that was corrected, in spite of what seemed to be a reluctance on the part of the administration at the time.
Well, of course, it was the internal politics in the Senate that got that thing out of there, basically. Actually, we had asked for $7 million plus, and I think it was $7 million plus, and we thought that was going to be adequate to buy the easements and do everything that needed to be done. It turned out, after some time had gone by, that it would require, I think it was another $9 million or thereabouts, and so we just went to the various people on the committee and those who had to pass the authorization, and explained to them, here we've got a part of the river that can't be completed. And if we don't complete it, what kind of a mess is that? So there was no big problem in getting the additional $9 million authorization.
Do you recall the meeting, and there was a map presented that showed potential development areas that might be allowed to proceed, that could have caused some real degradation on the river if that funding had not been
I don't
provided?
recall looking at a map, but I do recall that there were proposals for development. that could have done serious damage to the concept we were trying to, the environment we were trying to protect. I don't remember the map, though.
Okay. Getting on to the issue of legislative intent. Again, the attributes and characteristics of the valley that were most significant in considering its designation were the scenic beauty and the recreational value supported by good water quality. Is that a fair summary of your valuation of that resource for designation?
Well, it was unique. There wasn't any question about that. There was nothing quite like it elsewhere in the country of this, with this natural beauty, this purity of the water, this close to a major city. Start that question over again. I lost my train of thought.
Attributes and characteristics most significant to designation, scenic qualities, recreational qualities, supported by good water quality.
Yes, I think that would basically describe the elements that were basically the most important in preserving that river.
Given the location, as you have cited, close to the Twin Cities metropolitan area, did you as an author envision that the corridor should basically retain its 1970s look, if you will, pretty indefinitely under the mantle of the Wild and Scenic Rivers program?
Yeah, that was the hope. You see, once you the Organic Act of 1916, the Park Organic Act, says that the purpose of the parks was to preserve the scenic beauty, the geologic and archaeological sites, the wildlife therein, and to allow for the public enjoyment of it, and the key, to pass it on to future generations, quote, unimpaired. That's what it's all about, and that's the part that worries me, that the Park Service doesn't make a tough enough battle to live up to the provision of the law, the 1916 Act, or the one that authorized this one, that we're to pass it on unimpaired. Now, it isn't going to be unimpaired if they're going to allow growing, expanding, intensive use. It'll be destroyed. That's the part that worries me the most.
Of course, the final legislative outcome for the Lower St. Croix designation was a compromise. It required the federal government and the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin to act individually but cooperatively to develop a joint master plan and the compatible administrative rules. Now, as we look 20 years later, do you feel this is still the best arrangement for fulfilling the legislative intent and the practical implementation of the Riverway project?
No, and it wasn't my idea either to have a joint state administration of the 25 miles down below. I would have preferred that it be federally managed all the way. It would have been simpler, cleaner, and I think a better job.
Would you propose that that be looked at again?
If I were in the Senate, I probably would. I haven't looked at where they're at, in recent years. I just thought from the beginning to try to get three managers, the Park Service and the state of Minnesota and the state of Wisconsin, managing that was a mistake.
If I were to tell you that the states have relied primarily on local zoning standards backed up by state mandates for their management of the lower 25 miles, instead of acquiring scenic easements as the master plan indicated, at least in some priority pecking order. Does that disturb you? Does that worry you?
Sure. That would never have happened if the if the Park Service had the responsibility. I don't trust in the long term the idea of local zoning under the view or of the Park Service. So you get a guy like Jim Watt, he'll say, give it all away. You get a city council that doesn't care about protecting it, and then you're into a fight. I think that whole business is too bad. You should have gotten the easements and not left it up to local zoning, presumably to be enforced if it gets out of line by the Park Service. That's a bad arrangement.
Would you then feel much more confident about the long-term protection of the valley if the states retained their jurisdiction, if they went ahead and acquired easements that were compatible with those of the federal
Well, if
government?
they're going to retain jurisdiction, I would want them to go ahead and acquire easements, so you got something permanent.
You've spoken of the Park Service and some of the general feelings you have about their administration of the river as well as other areas. Do you know anything more, or do you have anything more to say about how well you think either they or the states have lived up to their responsibilities on the Riverway at this time?
Well, we've just looked at the question of the states relying upon zoning instead of easements, and I think that's I think that's a mistake. I don't want to try to judge. I haven't looked at it closely enough in the last few years to make a judgment as to exactly how well those things are going right now.
What changes, if any, in Riverway use or development criteria or practices can you think of? And you brought something up before about what might have happened in 20 years if the designation hadn't gone into effect. Can you think of anything now that could happen out there that might deviate so far from the legislative intent that it might cause the federal or state officials to want to actually withdraw it from the national system?
Well, politically that'd be a tough thing to do unless the senators from each state said that that's the only way you're going to save it. And if it was backed up by the congressman in the district, but that's not going to happen.
While the Lower St. Croix outlined an objective for scenic easements in the state zone and the locally administered standards and rules with the ultimate veto was put into effect, I take it that you feel that is a weaker political arrangement for land use control and may not serve effectively to provide long-term protection of the scenic view from the river. Is that a fair analysis of your views?
That's correct, and I think it is correct, and it isn't reassuring for the long term that kind of arrangement will protect the scenic beauty of the area under the state's control, which was one of the main functions of or main purposes of the act.
Senator, the organic 1968 Federal Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, of which you were a co-author, provides for the classification of segments of designated rivers to be managed as either wild, scenic, or recreational river zones, and that depended on the extent of development and access at the time of designation. Do you feel the legislation intended that segments like most of the Lower St. Croix Riverway classified as recreational can be allowed to develop more freely than if classified as wild or scenic?
Well, I think some people would no doubt interpret the word recreation to allow more uses that wouldn't be permitted, obviously wouldn't be permitted in the wild section, and wouldn't be permitted if it were identified as scenic. I never cared too much about that designation of recreation. I think scenic would have been better. But nonetheless, the idea behind the law, even if it were identified as a recreation river or section of a river, still was to be managed in such a way as to preserve the integrity of the amenities that were there at the time it was adopted, and it worries me that that is not being really fully achieved.
We bring
Neither would Fritz Mondale.
The last series of questions is just a few dealing with Lower St. Croix Riverway management coordination. And it's necessary to address this issue because of that compromise, which ended up being a combination of state and federal management. Less than 10 months after that congressional designation that you fostered, the governors of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the regional director of the National Park Service signed a cooperative agreement outlining purposes and procedures for coordinating riverway management through a Lower St. Croix Management Commission. As you think of this arrangement today, do you feel it meets the intent of the riverway legislation as it came out? If not, how would you wish it could be changed?
Well, I don't think it's being managed the way the general intent of the law intended it to be managed, not as carefully, and that's because you got 3 managers involved. Well, you probably got more than that. You got the 2 states, you got the Park Service, plus you've got municipalities that have the authority to do zoning. It's a mishmash of business which I think tends to end up at the lowest common denominator. So I don't think it's a good arrangement.
How do you feel about the idea of adding representatives of these local governments or commercial interests who have a stake in it to this management commission as a way of bringing stronger stewardship to bear on those responsible people?
Well, if it would bring stronger stewardship, fine. But I don't know whether adding a lot of people creates more divisiveness and less capacity to make a decision. I don't know how you take an arrangement which basically is unsound and then make it work by adding to it.
In the midst of all this, do you see a best role in any overall arrangement for the umbrella organization as the Minnesota-Wisconsin Boundary Area Commission serves?
Do I see
a role in this overall multi-party arrangement for the Boundary Area Commission to serve in some sort of a coordinative role?
I think you've asked a question I'm not very qualified to answer on that one.
Can you recommend any other actions that the Riverway Managing Agencies or the Boundary Commission might take to build a stronger long-term protection network for the Riverway involving local officials and landowners who are stakeholders? For example, education programs, information programs, public involvement efforts, or the like?
Well, as I understand, the mission here is to, as a general proposition, evaluate the current status of the valley. Where was it when the law was passed? Where is it now, and where is it going? And I think it's important for everybody to understand this: the local officials, the states, the Park Service, the Boundary Waters Commission. And I think that if you can demonstrate, as I think you will end up demonstrating, that the river is being overpressured, and that you've got to do something about it if you're going to maintain the uniqueness of this remarkable piece of water, which can't be found anywhere else in the United States in a similar setting. If this is all brought out, and then recommendations are made to reduce the pressure and to be sure that the pressure does not increase, that you could develop public support for it. And I think that that ought to be one of the objectives.
For the public to really understand how to lend their own support and do things on their own as citizens, do you feel it's important for them to have some tools such as a regular information source, maybe a video that describes the riverway system in a way that they can understand and feel personal about?
Well, I hadn't thought about that, but I think that would be a good educational tool that could be used not only in the school systems, where it obviously ought to be, but also before chambers of commerce and labor unions and church groups and everything, so that they get informed about what this is about. I think if you went out and asked the ordinary, just ask somebody on the street, what happened, do you think that the use of the river has gone far beyond the saturation point and is ending up degrading the river at this stage in history? You'd have some people, I've gotten some letters, you'd have some people say, yes, it's horrendous, but I think most people, since it happens subtly over a long period of time, it isn't noticed. How do you get somebody to say, well, let's see, I remember exactly what it was like in 1968 when the river bill passed, and then when the study started, and now it's 22 years later, and I can measure the changes. You just can't. You need to be able to have some baseline stuff to show in order to show people what's happening and what will happen to that river 25 years down the line unless we do something right now. If people understand that, then they're prepared to support some measures that otherwise might be quite unpopular. But if they understand that this is the only way this remarkable section of river is going to be saved, then you get powerful support for taking the measures that need to be taken to protect it.
You have some firsthand knowledge, apparently, of the current physical condition and use levels, and so I guess in terms of the way the coordinated management program has gone, would you say that it has exceeded legislative intent or generally lived up to it, or had moderate success but there's degradation, some success but degradation is prevalent, or general failure?
Well, those are a lot of options. I think you'd have to say some success, but degradation is present and provable. There isn't any question about that. And the question is, are we going to let it continue? Are we going to bring it to a halt so that our children and our grandchildren and people beyond will be able to go in this huge metropolitan area and see this beautiful jewel still there, still beautiful, still uncorrupted, and not a floating Coney Island?
One final question. You've brought up many times the legacy of the gift of Northern States Power Company. There may be other corporate citizens and people who have the means to really take a lead role, even now, 20 years later, in helping to reset the vision for this river. Do you have any advice to offer those kind of people, the thought leaders, the people who are recognized, the corporate citizens of the area, as to how they could play a part in all this? Well,
as you evaluate the situation and finally come out with a report that says here's what's happening, and in 1971 we already had reached saturation point. Now we're 4 times beyond that, and our prediction is it'll be 10 times that in another 15, 20 years. I think you can bring in all kinds of leadership that recognizes both sides of this river. Business people, labor leaders, citizen groups, to say, now let's get together here and work out a program that saves what we've got and not let it deteriorate. I think that can easily be done because all of these groups and all these people recognize they need some leadership. Somebody has to coalesce it. And once you've got your report, I think that can be done, and I would call upon all these groups.
Do you have any things that you would like to say for the sense of history that you have in this area that maybe my grandchildren should hear about their opportunities for the future and their responsibilities as citizens?
Well, I think I think that individuals can make a great contribution to what's going on about them. Whether if they don't have a chance to do something on a river as big as the St. Croix, they got a chance to do something about a marsh in their local community or a trout stream or some scenically beautiful thing, and everybody ought to get in and participate, and that's happening more and more around the country.
We thank you very much. This has been a wonderful reunion, and we're glad that your vision of the St. Croix is still as sharp as it is.
Well, thank you.